The Arizona Territory, 1,882, was known for its vast, wild landscapes, endless deserts, jagged mountain ranges, and rugged, untamed wilderness. During most of the year, the land was scorching hot and dry, with the sun beating down relentlessly. But when winter arrived, everything changed. The air grew colder, the winds sharper, and the land transformed into something unrecognizable. It was on one such cold winter day when a sudden blizzard hit without warning. The storm came out of nowhere, and its fury was unlike anything anyone could have expected. The snow fell in thick sheets, swirling around in gusts so strong that it seemed to come from every direction at once. What had started as a light snowfall turned into a raging storm within minutes, covering the entire land in a thick blanket of white. The winds howled, and the temperature dropped quickly, making it impossible for any traveler to continue their journey. In the midst of the blizzard, two Apache sisters, Tala and Aylin, found themselves trapped in the unforgiving wilderness. They had been riding their horses for miles, heading toward a small trading post where they hoped to exchange goods with settlers. It was a journey they had made many times before, but this time, the storm was far worse than anything they had experienced. The snow quickly built up around them, and soon, the landscape became unrecognizable. What should have been an easy route became a treacherous path, one that the sisters could not navigate on their own. Tala, the older sister, tried to remain calm as she urged their horses forward. But even she could sense that something was terribly wrong. She had lived much of her life in the wild, hunting, gathering, and surviving the harsh conditions of the desert. But no one could prepare for a storm like this. Its strength was overwhelming. She turned back to look at Aylin, who was struggling behind her, her horse slipping in the deep snow. Aylin was young and quick-witted, but she was also vulnerable in the face of such extreme weather. She was shivering badly, and her eyes looked scared as she struggled to stay on her horse. "Stay close, Aylin," Tala shouted over the howling wind, her voice barely audible above the storm. "We have to keep moving, or we'll freeze out here." Aylin nodded, though she could hardly see her sister through the thick snow. She tried to urge her horse forward, but the animal was exhausted, its legs buckling under the weight of the snow and the cold. The sisters had been traveling for hours, and their horses were barely able to carry them any further. Their supplies were running low, and Aylin could feel the weight of the cold creeping into her bones. "Why don't we just turn back?" Aylin suggested weakly, her breath coming out in short, pained gasps. "This storm is too strong. We're not going to make it." Tala shook her head, her face grim with determination. "Turning back means we'll get lost in the snow. We have to find shelter. Anything to protect us from the storm. We're not turning back." But Tala's words were easier said than done. The storm continued to rage around them, and even Tala couldn't see where they were going anymore. The snow had covered their tracks, and they were no longer on a familiar path. Everything looked the same, endless, white. The wind pushed them in all directions, and the cold was so intense it felt as though it was biting into their skin. Aylin's hands were numb, and she could barely hold the reins. Her face was pale, and her lips were turning blue from the cold. She wanted to scream in frustration, but couldn't find the strength. She glanced around desperately, hoping to see any sign of shelter. But all she could see was snow. Snow, and more snow. Tala, too, was feeling the weight of the storm on her body. She had spent many winters in the wild, but nothing had prepared her for a storm this brutal. Her face was frozen, and her fingers were stiff as she tried to keep her horse moving. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized they were in serious danger. If they didn't find shelter soon, the cold would overtake them, and they would be lost to the storm. Just as the sisters were beginning to lose hope, something incredible happened. Through the thick snow and swirling winds, a shadow appeared in the distance. It was a figure, a person, moving toward them through the storm. At first, the sisters thought they might be imagining it. The storm played tricks on the eyes, distorting shapes and blurring vision. But as the figure came closer, they could make out the shape of a man on horseback, riding steadily toward them, despite the storm. Tala's heart leapt with a mix of surprise and cautious hope. She had never seen anyone out here, in this kind of weather. Who would be brave enough to ride through such a blizzard? Stay close to me, Aylin, Tala whispered, feeling both fear and relief. She couldn't tell who the rider was. But at this point, anyone who could survive the storm was someone they needed. Let's see who it is. As the man approached, the sisters could see that he was a tall, rugged figure, his face partly hidden beneath the brim of his hat and the heavy snow that clung to his clothes. His horse was strong and seemed unfazed by the storm, though it was clearly tired. The man slowed as he came closer to the sisters, and in a voice that was surprisingly calm for someone out in such a brutal blizzard, he called out to them. "Are you two lost?" he asked, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Tala hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust the stranger. In times like these, survival was more important than trust. But desperation quickly took over. She nodded, grateful for any kind of help. "Yes, we are. The storm. It's too much." The man nodded, understanding the danger immediately. He gestured for the sisters to follow him. "I know a cabin not far from here. It's sheltered from the wind. I can help you get there." Tala was hesitant at first. She knew that many white settlers were distrustful of Native Americans, and the two sisters were no exception. But there was something about this man's calm demeanor that made her feel like they had no choice but to trust him. He seemed to be offering them a chance at survival, and that was all that mattered now. With little choice, Tala urged Aylin to follow the man's lead. The storm was so fierce that it was impossible to see clearly, but they followed his figure through the blizzard, praying that the stranger knew what he was doing. The man led them through the storm, each step a small victory in the battle against the elements. Despite the cold and the wind, the sisters felt a glimmer of hope. They didn't know who this man was, but they knew they had to trust him if they wanted to survive the storm. As they finally reached the shelter of the man's cabin, the sisters felt a sense of relief wash over them. They had made it through the worst of the storm, and they had found someone who was willing to help them in the most desperate of times. Little did they know that this encounter would change their lives forever. The storm raged on outside the small cabin, its fury crashing against the wooden walls, but inside, the warmth of a crackling fire and the scent of dry wood filled the air. Tala and Aylin sat huddled near the hearth, their faces flushed with the warmth that seemed almost magical after hours spent in the icy cold. Their hands, once stiff and numb from the freezing temperatures, were slowly coming back to life, tingling with the return of feeling. They had followed the stranger, their mysterious savior, through the storm, unsure of where they were headed, but grateful for the hope he had brought. Now, as they sat in the small, cozy cabin, the sisters could hardly believe how quickly their lives had changed. The fierce winds and blinding snow outside felt like a distant nightmare, and for the first time in hours, they could breathe a little easier. The man, who had introduced himself as Jedediah Barnes, moved around the cabin, tending to the fire with an ease that came from years of experience. He was calm and quiet, the kind of man who didn't waste words. His movements were precise, almost like he was used to living alone and taking care of himself. He didn't seem to mind the two strangers in his cabin, as though it was second nature for him to help those in need. Tala, who had always been cautious about trusting outsiders, couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude for this man. The cabin was small, but well kept. It had a simple charm, with rough-hewn wooden beams and a low ceiling. A few animal pelts were draped over chairs, and the smell of fresh-baked bread filled the room, though Tala wasn't sure if it was from before the storm or something Jed had recently made. There were shelves filled with jars of preserved food and other supplies that hinted at his self-sufficiency. Tala and Aylin looked around, trying to take in their surroundings while still recovering from the shock of being rescued. They had been certain they were going to die out there, lost in the storm. But now, in this warm little cabin, they felt a sense of safety they hadn't known in days. "Here, you should drink this." Jed's voice broke the silence, pulling them from their thoughts. He had poured them both a mug of something warm, steam rising from the liquid inside. Tala could smell the strong scent of coffee mixed with something else. Perhaps a touch of sweet spice. It wasn't much, but it was enough to lift their spirits. Tala took the mug with a quiet thanks, raising it to her lips. The warmth of the drink spread through her body, and for a moment, she felt like everything might be all right. She glanced over at Aylin, who was sipping hers slowly, her eyes wide with exhaustion. It was clear that the younger sister was still in shock, though the warmth of the cabin had begun to bring some color back to her cheeks. Jed sat down at a small table, his rough hands resting on its edge as he watched the sisters with quiet interest. He didn't ask questions right away, as if he knew they needed time to recover from the terror they had just faced. Instead, he let the sisters drink in silence, allowing the warmth and the safety of the cabin to work its magic. After a while, Tala found her voice again. She cleared her throat, her words coming out soft and uncertain, unsure how to address the man who had saved them. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We didn't know if we were going to make it. The storm, it came so quickly. I don't know how you found us." Jed's gaze softened as he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I was out hunting," he said simply. "I knew a storm was coming. I wasn't sure how bad it'd get, but I've been through worse. When I saw you two out there, I couldn't just leave you. No one should have to face a storm like that alone." Tala nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always been taught to rely on herself and her sister, to never trust strangers. But Jed's actions had proven something different. He wasn't just another settler out for himself. He had put his life at risk to help them without asking for anything in return. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the soft glow filled the cabin. The storm outside seemed to fade away as they sat there, the three of them in quiet companionship. After a while, Aylin spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help us?" she asked, her eyes wide as she looked at Jed. She was young, and though she had been taught to be cautious around settlers, her curiosity got the better of her. "You didn't have to. We're Apache. Most people wouldn't have helped." Jed seemed unbothered by the question, though his gaze grew distant, as if thinking carefully before answering. "I reckon I've seen enough to know that people are people," he said slowly. "It doesn't matter what tribe you come from, or what color your skin is. I've learned that in this world, it's kindness that matters most. If we don't help each other when we can, then what's the point of living in the first place?" Tala was taken aback by his response. She had grown up in a world where there was little trust between the settlers and her people. For Jed to speak so freely, so openly, about kindness was surprising. But in a way, it made sense. In the wild, there was no room for prejudice. Survival was the only thing that mattered. And now, as she looked at Jed's calm face, she realized that he had likely faced many of the same struggles. He wasn't a man of words, he was a man of action. He didn't need to say much to make his intentions clear. The sisters sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. The warmth of the fire, the food they'd been given, and the safety of the cabin were more than they could have hoped for in the middle of the storm. But something else lingered in the air, something unspoken. They both knew that they had been saved, not just by a man's kindness, but by fate itself. The storm had brought them to Jed, and now they were in his care. Jed stood up slowly, stretching his arms above his head before turning to the sisters. "You two should get some rest," he said. "The storm isn't letting up, and it's best if you stay here for the night. I'll keep the fire going, and we'll see what the morning brings." Tala nodded, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Aylin, too, looked like she could barely stay awake. The cabin was small, but there was a warm bed near the fire, and Jed had already made space for them to sleep. As they lay down, the warmth of the blankets wrapped around them like a shield against the cold outside. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tala and Aylin allowed themselves to relax, knowing they were safe. But even as they drifted off to sleep, their minds were filled with questions. Who was this man, really? What did he expect in return for his kindness? And, more troubling to Tala, what would happen when the storm passed and they had to leave? As sleep slowly claimed them, the sisters could hear the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of the fire inside. They had been saved from the storm, but the path ahead was uncertain. They couldn't help but wonder what their future might hold now. Under Jed's roof, the storm continued to batter the small cabin for hours, the wind howling like a wild beast trying to tear its way inside. But inside, everything was calm. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, its warmth slowly filling every corner of the room. Tala and Aylin woke to the quiet crackling of the fire, their bodies still heavy from the exhaustion of the previous days. For the first time in what felt like forever, they woke up without the fear of freezing, without the terror of being lost in a storm. It was early morning when the two sisters stirred, the gray light of dawn filtering through the small cabin's window. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside was still covered in a thick layer of white, as though nature itself had been frozen in place. Tala slowly sat up, stretching her stiff limbs, and looked around. Aylin, her younger sister, was already awake and watching the fire, her face soft with thought. Jed, who had kept watch through the night, was sitting by the hearth, sharpening a knife. His calm presence filled the room, and his steady movements made the sisters feel a sense of stability. He had been quiet the night before, not asking questions but simply offering help when it was needed. Tala had noticed his easy manner, the way he seemed at home in the wilderness. She wondered what kind of life he led, what had brought him to this remote place. Aylin looked up at Jed, then back to her sister. "It's hard to believe the storm's over," she said softly. Her voice held a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "We almost didn't make it. But he didn't leave us." She glanced over at Jed again, who was still focused on his task. Tala nodded. "He didn't. I don't know why, but I'm glad he didn't." Her voice was quiet, but her words carried a weight of truth. She had never expected to find someone like Jed in such a wild, isolated place. And yet, here he was, offering them shelter, food, and warmth, when they needed it most. Jed finished sharpening the knife and stood up, moving toward the door. "We'll need to clear a path if we're going to get out of here. The snow's deep, but I'll make sure you're able to get back to the road," he said, his voice steady, as always. Tala hesitated for a moment before standing up to join him. "We'll help. We can't just sit here." Aylin followed her sister's lead, though she seemed less eager to face the cold again. She had grown comfortable in the warmth of the cabin, and the thought of stepping back into the harsh, snow-covered world felt daunting. Jed smiled, though it was a small, reserved smile. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. The storm may have passed, but the world out there's still harsh. I won't leave you stranded." There was something in Jed's words that made Tala pause. He wasn't just offering them shelter. He was offering safety, a place to stay. It was more than what she had expected. In the past, when she and Aylin had sought refuge from storms, they had always been turned away, told to go back to their people or leave the land. But Jed's kindness wasn't motivated by anything but the simple need to help. As they moved toward the door, Tala glanced at Aylin, who seemed to shrink back at the thought of facing the snow again. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Aylin nodded, though her face showed signs of uncertainty. "It's just, I don't want to leave. This place feels safe. I never thought I'd feel safe with a stranger, especially not a settler." One quote. Tala understood. She had felt the same way when they first arrived, unsure if they could trust Jed. But after the way he had cared for them, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. I know. But we don't know how long we'll be able to stay. We should leave while we can still move safely. Jed had already opened the door, the bright white of the snow outside making it seem almost blinding. The air was cold, biting, but there was no wind now, just the peaceful stillness of a world blanketed by snow. The tracks they had made through the storm were already covered, but Jed seemed to know exactly where he was going. He motioned for the sisters to follow him. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them immediately. It wasn't as sharp as the storm's fury, but it was still enough to make their breath visible in the air. Jed's footsteps cut through the snow as he moved toward a small woodpile near the cabin, gathering what he needed to start clearing a path. Tala watched him for a moment, then turned to Aylin. "We'll be all right. Let's just help him get things ready. And then we'll figure out what comes next." Aylin nodded again, her face still pensive. The cold was starting to creep into her bones, but she could tell that being outside in the fresh air felt different from the suffocating atmosphere of the storm. There was something about the silence of the snow-covered world that felt peaceful. Over the next few hours, the three of them worked together to clear the path. Jed worked quickly and efficiently, as though he had done this many times before, while Tala and Aylin helped as best as they could. The work was tiring, but there was something satisfying about it, something that made the three of them feel like they were a team. Tala couldn't help but notice how easy it felt to be working alongside Jed. Even though they had just met, she had expected the usual tension, the usual suspicion that often came between her people and the settlers. But with Jed, there was none of that. There was only a shared understanding that they were all working toward the same goal: survival. After a while, the path was cleared enough for the horses to make their way through the snow. Jed saddled his horse, preparing to leave the cabin behind. He looked at the sisters, his eyes thoughtful, but steady. "You two don't have to go right now. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. But if you want to continue your journey, I can take you part of the way." Tala and Aylin exchanged glances. For the first time, the decision didn't feel as clear-cut. They had spent days trying to survive on their own, running from one storm to the next, uncertain of where they were going. But here, with Jed, they were starting to feel a different kind of safety, a kind of peace they hadn't known before. Tala felt a knot of uncertainty in her chest. She had always relied on herself, always moved from place to place, never staying too long in one spot. But now, she wasn't so sure anymore. "We'll think about it," Tala said, her voice a little softer than she intended. She didn't know if she was ready to stay, but she knew one thing for certain. Her heart had softened toward Jed. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than always running. As they stood there, watching Jed ready his horse, Tala realized that something had changed in her. The harsh, unforgiving world they lived in didn't have to be just about survival. Sometimes, it was about finding kindness in the most unexpected places. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could change all of their lives. The days after the storm had passed were filled with a strange quietness. The world outside was still and peaceful, blanketed under the heavy snow that had once caused so much chaos. Inside the small cabin, life had settled into a rhythm. Jed kept busy with his work, hunting and preparing for whatever the next day might bring. Tala and Aylin had begun to help around the cabin, chopping wood and tending to the fire. Though the world had calmed, the three of them found themselves in an unspoken limbo, as if everything they knew had shifted slightly, but not enough for them to fully understand what had changed. Each morning, they awoke to the sound of the crackling fire and the sight of a world made quiet by the snow. But as much as they enjoyed the warmth of the cabin and the safety Jed offered, neither Tala nor Aylin could ignore the tension that simmered just below the surface. Tala had always been independent. She had learned at a young age that survival meant never relying on anyone. The world was a harsh place, especially for the Apache. and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had always moved from one place to another, never staying too long in one spot, always keeping her distance from settlers and outsiders. But now, after spending so much time with Jed, something had changed inside her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but there was a part of her that no longer wanted to leave. She often found herself thinking about what their future might look like. What would happen when the snow melted? Would they go back to their people? To the life they had known before? Or was there something more here? A question lingered in her mind. Could they stay? Could they stay with Jed? Aylin, too, was torn. She had always been the more open and trusting of the two sisters. From the moment Jed had saved them in the storm, she had felt a sense of gratitude toward him. But now, as time passed, she found herself thinking about the implications of their decision. It wasn't just about whether or not to stay in the cabin. It was about what staying would mean for their future. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the background, Tala and Aylin sat together at the small table, both lost in thought. Jed had gone out to check his traps, leaving the sisters alone for the moment. The silence between them was thick, and both of them seemed hesitant to break it. Finally, Aylin spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Do you think we should stay here, Tala?" Tala looked up from the fire, surprised by the question. She had expected Aylin to be the one to bring it up, but she had hoped they might avoid talking about it for a little longer. It wasn't a question they could answer easily. "I don't know," she said, her voice low. "I've never stayed in one place for this long, Aylin. And we've always kept our distance from settlers. I don't know what would happen if we stayed." Quote, Aylin looked down at her hands, twirling a piece of thread between her fingers. "I know what you mean, but it feels different here, doesn't it?" She looked up at her sister, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I don't feel like we're in danger, not like before. I think Jed is different." Tala sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window, where the soft light of the setting sun bathed the snowy landscape in a warm, golden glow. "I know, he's kind. But we don't know what would happen if others found out we were staying here. What if someone came looking for us?" 2. "We're not doing anything wrong," Aylin said softly, her voice full of conviction. "And I don't think Jed would ever turn us away. He's given us everything we need, and he hasn't asked for anything in return." Tala stared at the fire for a moment, her mind racing. Aylin was right. Jed hadn't asked for anything, and he had shown them more kindness than most people would ever show anyone. He had saved them from the storm without a second thought. And since then, he had cared for them like family. Tala couldn't deny that she had begun to feel a sense of peace here that she hadn't felt anywhere else. But there was a deeper question gnawing at her. Was it enough? Could they truly stay, knowing how difficult life would be if they did? They weren't the only ones living in the wild. They weren't the only ones struggling to survive. And if they stayed with Jed, would they ever be able to go back to their own people? Would they be seen as traitors? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened, and Jed stepped inside, carrying a bundle of firewood in his arms. He smiled at the sisters, his face warm and familiar. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said with a quiet laugh, setting the wood by the hearth. "But I thought I'd let you know that the weather's starting to clear up. We might be able to make our way back to the main trail soon." Tala felt her heart tighten at his words. She had known this day would come, the day when they would have to decide whether to stay or leave. But the thought of leaving Jed's cabin, leaving this small pocket of safety they had found together, was harder than she had imagined. Aylin spoke up before Tala could, her voice trembling slightly. "Jed, what would happen if we stayed here with you? Would it be all right? We don't want to be a burden." Jed looked at her with a thoughtful expression. He set down the firewood and took a seat across from the sisters. "You're not a burden," he said quietly, his tone sincere. "You've helped me as much as I've helped you. If you decide to stay, that's your choice. I won't make you feel uncomfortable about it." He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. But I'll tell you this. I've lived out here alone for a long time. I've never really had anyone to share it with. And I know that life can be harsh. But sometimes, it's nice to have company. To have people you can count on. Tala looked at Jed, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. She hadn't expected him to be so open about his feelings. He had always been so reserved, so steady. But there was something in his words that made her reconsider everything. You don't have to decide right now, Jed added, noticing the uncertain look on their faces. Take your time. But just know that if you choose to stay, you're not alone anymore. I've got your back, no matter what. For the first time in a long while, Tala felt something shift inside her. She realized that, for all her fears and doubts, maybe this wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe they didn't have to keep running. Maybe they could stay, build a new life with Jed, and find a sense of belonging in a world that often seems so divided. The sisters exchanged a long look, their silent conversation speaking volumes. Finally, Tala spoke, her voice steady, but with a quiet determination. We'll stay. For now, at least. But we'll have to see where it leads. Aylin smiled, a sense of relief washing over her face. I think this is right, Tala. I think we can trust him. Jed nodded, his expression softening. As the evening drew on, the three of them settled in together. The warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship filling the cabin. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, the sisters felt something they hadn't known in a long time: hope. The days turned into weeks, and the small cabin in the heart of the wilderness began to feel like a home. For the first time, Tala and Aylin allowed themselves to settle into a routine, one that revolved around the warmth of the fire, the rhythm of daily chores, and the quiet companionship of Jed. They worked together gathering wood, hunting, and preparing food. Even as winter held its icy grip on the land, they found comfort in each other's company, a bond that had slowly grown stronger with each passing day. Jed, always calm and steady, seemed to fit into this small family dynamic with ease. He had lived alone for so long that at first, Tala had wondered if he would be bothered by their presence. But as the days went by, she noticed how naturally he had welcomed them into his life. His stoic nature, which had once seemed so distant, now felt like a pillar they could lean on. He didn't expect anything from them except their respect and willingness to work together. In return, he gave them safety, food, and warmth, the very things they had been missing for so long. Tala and Aylin, for their part, had never imagined they would find a sense of peace in a place like this. Before meeting Jed, they had lived lives defined by movement, uncertainty, and the constant struggle to survive. Now, in the midst of the snow-covered wilderness, they had found something they never thought possible: stability. And with that stability came a growing sense of belonging, something that neither of them had ever experienced outside their tribe. But even as they grew closer, there were moments when Tala's old instincts, her fears and doubts crept to the surface. She would catch herself staring out the window, wondering what their future held. The world beyond the cabin was still dangerous, and she knew it wasn't always easy for Apache and settlers to live side by side. Despite Jed's kindness, she worried about what would happen if others found out they were living with him. Would they be turned away? Would their presence cause trouble for Jed? And what about their people? What would they think if they learned that Tala and Aylin had stayed with a settler? One night, as the wind howled outside, Tala couldn't shake these thoughts. She sat by the fire, her eyes staring into the dancing flames, lost in thought. Aylin, sensing her sister's unease, sat beside her. The younger sister had become more at ease with their new life, but she knew that Tala was still struggling with the idea of staying. "What's on your mind, Tala?" Aylin asked quietly, her voice gentle. Tala hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. "I just keep thinking about what happens next." What if the storm wasn't the only thing we have to face? What if someone comes looking for us? Her voice trembled slightly, though she quickly masked it with a deep breath. Aylin took her sister's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. But we're not alone anymore. Jed's not like the others. He's different. We're safe here, and we've both learned to take care of ourselves. We don't have to be afraid anymore. Tala looked at her sister, seeing the determination in her eyes. She had never been able to hide her emotions from Aylin, and Aylin, in turn, always seemed to know when something was bothering her. I know you're right, Tala said, her voice quieter now. But the world doesn't always make sense. What happens when the snow melts? When the roads open up and we're forced to go back to the world outside? We can't just stay here forever. It feels like we're ignoring something bigger than ourselves. Our people. Our tribe. What will they think if they find out we've been living with a settler? Aylin's eyes softened, and she moved closer to her sister. Tala, we don't have to leave right away. And maybe the world has changed. Maybe it's not the way we thought it was before. She paused, thinking carefully. We can go back to the tribe when the time is right, but for now, we can build something here. We can choose our own path. Tala gazed into the fire again, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't realized how much the idea of belonging had crept into her heart until Aylin's words had made her see it clearly. Perhaps they had been running for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to create something that could last. As the fire burned down to a soft glow, Tala thought of Jed, who was sitting quietly at the table, sharpening his knife. His steady presence had become a comfort, and though she had always kept her distance from settlers, she couldn't deny that he had treated them with a kindness that few others had ever shown. He hadn't asked them to be anything other than themselves. He hadn't judged them for their past or their heritage. He had simply given them the space they needed to heal. The following day, as they worked together to prepare a meal, Tala and Aylin shared a quiet conversation. There was a sense of finality in their voices as they spoke of their decision. They had made up their minds. They would stay for now, at least. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they knew one thing. They had found something worth fighting for. They had found peace. Jed, as always, didn't push them to make a decision. He simply smiled when he saw them working together, the three of them moving as one unit. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between them. He didn't need to ask if they were ready to leave. He would let them decide in their own time. And for now, they had chosen to stay. Weeks passed, and spring slowly began to break through the winter's hold. The snow melted, and the landscape that had once seemed so harsh and unwelcoming began to show signs of life. The trees started to bud, and the air grew warmer with each passing day. The change in the seasons felt like a sign of new beginnings, and for the sisters, it marked the start of a new chapter in their lives. As the days grew longer and the nights shorter, Tala and Aylin began to feel more connected to the land around them. They started to plant small crops near the cabin, learning from Jed how to cultivate the soil, how to use the land to their advantage. Jed, too, seemed to come alive with the changing season. He spent more time outside, preparing for the months ahead, and the sisters found themselves learning from him in ways they hadn't expected. They weren't just surviving now, they were starting to build something together. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Tala found herself smiling at the thought of the future. She had come to terms with the fact that life could be unpredictable. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. But maybe that was okay. Maybe life wasn't about certainty, it was about living in the moment and embracing what came. And right now, this moment with Jed, with her sister, felt more than enough. We've come a long way, haven't we? Tala said softly, her gaze resting on the fire. Aylin looked at her, her face lit with a smile. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky above them, Tala and Aylin knew that they had found a place where they belonged. They were no longer running. They had found a home, and with it, a sense of hope that had been missing from their lives for far too long.